Guys, thank you so much for agreeing to join us today for an episode of the show. I know that we've got an international setting here. Julia, husband is looking after the kids, and you find yourself joining us from Sydney, Australia. So thank you so much for sticking around in the evening and joining us here. Michael, I know you're based in the UK alongside us. So guys, just really thank you for joining us for today's show.
Yeah, great to be here, Charlie. Thank you.
Thank you. Very excited to be here and glad to talk to you over the next hour or so.
Fantastic. Thank you, Michael. Thanks, Julia. Okay, guys. So as we kind of talked about in our preamble, the show always begins with to be honest, a bit of a deep dive into the backgrounds of the guests that we have on our show. Now, I'm super excited by this conversation. We've spoken before because of the nature of what you guys are both doing now in terms of your professional expertise. And we'll come on to that in a minute. But Julia, perhaps we can start with you. You start wherever you would like in terms of your background and experience, but just give our listeners a bit of a flavor as to you and the things that have really inspired you throughout your career. That's the key thing for us. We're really keen to understand, those key pivotal moments of inspiration and motivation and direction that's led you to ultimately the role that you're in now.
Yeah, great. Thanks, Charlie. Well, I'd probably take you back to when I started my career and starting in communications and marketing. And I very quickly learned that marketing pushing things to people that they didn't really need was not something I particularly enjoyed or was particularly good at. So I was always drawn to companies or projects where there was purpose or where there was some kind of impact or an idea of business using their power to do something good and worthwhile. And I found myself in an agency in London which did some really interesting work in this space. So I got an opportunity to work with some really inspirational leaders in this space. I got an opportunity to work with some really interesting brands in this space, including spending a good amount of time working with Unilever. So when working with Unilever, this was a few years back now. So this was when Unilever had the Unilever Sustainable Living Plan. It had just been launched. Paul Polman was at the helm, and this really was setting a new standard for what business could do in terms of business being a force for good. Mm-hmm. And I got to work on some really interesting projects at that time. So one was Lifebuoy, which was some people may know Lifebuoy as a soap. It was in the UK a very long time ago, but it's still very much a growing brand around the world. And with the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, they created a behaviour change model to encourage children to wash their hands at 5 key times a day to reduce diarrheal disease and reduce child mortality. Mm-hmm. And it was a really incredible program to be part of, and we did a lot of advocacy around that. And so this is back at the time with the Millennium Development Goals, and we spent a lot of time trying to sort of bring the private sector voice to the table and encouraging collaboration ahead of the development of the Sustainable Development Goals, mm-hmm. And water, sanitation and hygiene to be included as part of that. I also did a lot of work in the space of sanitation, setting up partnerships with UNICEF, and trying to get people to have interesting conversations about sanitation, which was not something that's very easy. And I won't go into the details there, but it was one of those issues where there are sanitation essentially impacts so many people and is, among the key causes of mortality around the world, yet people aren't willing to talk about it. People aren't willing to talk about diarrheal disease and toilets. And if we don't talk about a problem, how on earth are we going to solve it? So it was a really sort of exciting time to be able to put that on the table. And, I was even involved with one a very interesting and incredible guy from Singapore who founded World Toilet Day, and we're at the UN sort of putting that in the calendar on November 19 to actually create the inaugural World Toilet Day, so that this was a moment in the calendar that people would actually have important conversations about the fact that we need to solve this problem.
Julia, I love that. I mean, talk about impact. I mean, that is a very serious situation and a serious subject area. Let me take you back though. Just for our listeners' view, and I think it's fascinating to give the timeline of events, if you like, in your career. But during the work that you're doing here, this is you're in a marketing and communications role. You're not in a sustainability role at this stage. So you're viewing all of these initiatives and all this work that you're doing with the likes of Unilever through the marketing and comms sort of channel, aren't you? Am I understanding that correctly?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. So, I mean, well, firstly, I think that sustainability and communications, I think communications plays a really important role, working together to be able to affect change in so many different ways, but we'll get to that later on in the podcast. But I was working in a communications capacity, but I'm working you can't do this in just in a communications sense. So working with the partnerships team, the foundation, to be able to essentially create meaningful long-term partnerships that are going to not just come in and out at a moment where there is funding available, where you can actually create something that's going to have that longevity. Building it into the brand strategy so that it has that longevity, because this is one of the big problems. At the time, it was often called CSR, although I've for a long time borrowed the phrase, CSR has been dead since 2010. But essentially, when you are working on to be able to do some kind of social good in some way, shape, or form, or sustainability, it needs to be ingrained within the strategy. You can't have it as an add-on, because then it becomes the first thing to get cut when times get tough. And we are seeing examples of that today. But I also worked in a whole capacity of roles in this time, being able to actually instill targets as part of the company's plan, specifically around sanitation. To be able to, we also did work to be able to amplify the environmental pillars, to be able to build sustainability comms into brands around sustainability targets. How you communicate that in a meaningful way to your consumers, etc. So the roles that I did in that period of time were really broad, and it went from sustainability, marketing, communications, and through to consulting, because what I really did best, or what I was always really drawn to, is the sort of the power to use communications, but not just to use communications as a tool to be able to affect the change you want to create. And through that, building partnerships, creating inspiring campaigns that can create change. There's so many, I think, different opportunities there. But essentially, lots of different activities, lots of different roles that brought me to where I am today in Australia. When I left the UK, we set up
Julia, I'm so sorry to interrupt. You're in full flight, but we've got you in the UK at the moment. So I'm gonna ask a question or two about that. You mentioned that the beginning part of your career, and I think you probably massively understated yourself here, by the way, when you said that you'd realized that selling things to people that they didn't really necessarily need was something that you weren't particularly good at. I imagine you were very good at it, but you probably had identified, or there was a sense of identifying that, this isn't having the impact that I want to have in my career. Just talk us through that. Talk us through what that experience was like when you observed and realized that this wasn't as fulfilling and as impactful as you needed it to be. And what were the kind of practical steps that you took to say, look, if I want to head in a direction where I'm utilizing comms to actually have, really significant impact, what do I need to do in terms of my career development?
Yeah, so I think when I was working at that point and thinking, this is really not for me, because I just don't want to be pushing things to people that they don't need. It just felt very empty to me, and I've never been someone who's particularly materialistic. I don't think we should be following every fad. We don't think we should be copying every celebrity. I accept the way that the world works, but it's just not. It's not me, and I just couldn't be part of. I couldn't participate in that to really essentially make people, use the superpower that is communications for the wrong reason. So if I were telling myself what I would do, if I was talking to my younger self, there are so many ways that you can be able to educate yourself, to be able to understand more about sustainability, to be able to understand more about how you can build this in and educate others as well as part of this. But back then, those things didn't exist. Those courses didn't exist, or, education modules. And of course, I could have, gone back and went to university. Instead, I left, and I moved to, originally from Australia, moved to firstly France and then England, and that's where I found myself in it's a different world where I think there was a readiness to have conversations about the opportunity that the corporate sector could have to drive positive change.
Mhm.
And then once you sort of get into that, you become quite hooked. I think that you sort of saw more opportunities for brands to be able to do interesting things. And I think back then there wasn't such a focus, as much of a focus as there is today from consumers on the expectations around sustainability.
Mhm.
So there was a lot of focus on how you show up as a good corporate citizen to your to your consumers, to your stakeholders at that point. And then, sustainability really has been built into the core now. And really there's that shift where brands and companies need to be able to communicate, well, how is it that I'm actually being more sustainable? What is it that I'm doing? How am I able to, ultimately leave the planet off better than I found it?
I love that, Julia. I love that. Okay, so we find ourselves. We're now on the plane. We're flying back to Australia. Talk us through what happens. What happens next?
Right. So I went back to Australia, and if I'm very honest, I would say that I was so excited to bring all these ideas that I had to different businesses, and I just didn't find the same environment that I had working in London. I found that things were a little bit slower in the space of sustainability, and there was just less willingness to be able to communicate about it. And I think there was just a lower level of understanding in some areas. It was absolutely happening. It just wasn't at the forefront, and that took a couple of years.
And Julia, sorry to interrupt, but was this specifically within the realms of sort of sanitation, or was this more broadly around the concepts relating to sustainability?
This is more broadly around the concepts of sustainability. So sanitation was just one of the many projects that I'd worked on during the time that I was in the UK, which is about 10 years. So this was more broadly about, we focus on every aspect of sustainability. So we'll be having a conversation about carbon markets 1 minute, about circularity the next, about mobility the next, and sustainable infrastructure. So it really was looking at sustainability in terms of, how across the spectrum. And we wanted to work with companies who wanted to be able to sort of show up as a good corporate citizen, to show up as a responsible business. And initially, I found that there wasn't as much appetite in Australia as I had found in the UK, but it didn't take long for that to shift.
Mhm.
And then by the time 2019, 2020 came around, I think that Australia had started to catch up a lot on that. But in that time, or since then, I think we have had the privilege to work with so many brands to be able to tell their sustainability stories across the spectrum, from being able to use behavior change to get people to encourage people to act more sustainably as individuals, to be able to empower people as employees to be able to play meaningful roles in their sustainability strategy, to encouraging regulatory change that will see more sustainable outcomes. And it's only through, I guess, that continual curiosity and that sort of drive to be able to help companies on that journey that we've been able to do that.
Julia, let me ask you, I'm fascinated by I'll come back to where you've crescendoed there, but just in terms of Australia and how, what was it, do you think, was it just a natural progression in development, or were there any key kind of things that occurred, if you like, in Australia that sort of leveraged or developed the sustainability agenda, do you think, around that time, 2019, 2020?
I mean, we all have to play catch up with Europe. So I think there's things that just essentially come down the line. We follow a lot of Europe and America in many ways. I mean, obviously, by the time COP26 came around, everyone was in Australia was desperate for the government to do more in the space of sustainability. We won't go back to Australia's show at COP26 because I think most people might remember that. But we followed the trends. That was just we are an economy that is built on fossil fuels, essentially. We are a brown economy that's trying to green. So, these things are just a little bit different for Australia. It is a very unique environment. And, I think just naturally things are going to catch on a little bit slower. But, I think that has significantly shifted since I first arrived.
Mm. Interesting. And then you alluded to before that last response to obviously all the fantastic work that you're now enabling through your role working in Australia. But just give us a flavour of what those roles have looked like and who you've been working with sort of since you came back in 2019.
Yeah, I mean, so I think there's no 2 days that are the same. So I think when I first started, it was just there was. The space of sustainability is so incredibly broad, and it's changing every day. So there was just so much work to be able to make sure that I could be that expert every day across all of the different areas, all of which are evolving at such a great pace. Because of course, when you do have these conversations with these organizations, you're speaking with incredibly well-informed people who very clearly understand the regulatory environment, who very clearly understand where they need to get to. And we make it a point that we really want to be a partner with these organizations and make sure that we are clear that we're not going to support any level of greenwashing. We are trying to encourage authentic communication. So we need to have that level of expertise to do our job well. Mm-hmm. I remember a lot of very, very late nights when I first got started in this. But as I think with time you build your knowledge base, you build your understanding, and that's certainly made the role a bit easier. But we've one of our early clients in this space was Henkel, which is a global FMCG, and they're just an incredible company. They've been a sustainability leader for about 20 years or more, and we've been working with them on a number of different projects, working with brands to be able to find their voice on sustainability, to communicate authentically with their consumers. We've created multi-brand platforms which are focused on behavior change and encouraging sustainable behaviors. We've created really impactful partnerships with brands where we've been able to help a brand that is trying to stand for something in the space of sustainability find a partner that has an aligned value, where together they're able to do so much more than more together rather than apart. So that's been one incredible journey. We've worked with a big international trucking company to try and drive regulatory change, where they had a full fleet of electric vehicles, but the heaviest of which were not suitable for Australian roads because they were too heavy with the battery weight on the front steer axle. Mm-hmm. So a whole a truck that was able to solve significant challenges in Australia and fill a gap in the market that was essentially unable to drive on the roads. And since working with them, we've seen 4 states change their change the road rate rules to let these trucks on the roads, which has been incredibly rewarding and exciting to see. We have
Julia, you've done a lot. I mean, come on, you've headed back to Australia and you've just started changing things up. It's absolutely fantastic to hear. I've got 2 questions for you, because I know we're going to come on and talk a bit more in the context of, perhaps some of the sort of cases of things that you've worked on. But when you think about your career now, and you think about the fact that you've evolved, if you like, in terms of working maybe perhaps more in communication side, and then evolved into more sustainability experts in terms of your career, which, by the way, I love. That it's so wonderful to hear that you too have sat in meetings with experts in different areas of sustainability and thought, I probably need to spend a bit of time tonight reading up on X, Y, and Z. That's good to hear, because I've definitely had the similar experience, I have to say. But what have you learned, and what has been the impact of having had your career start in the communication space and then go into sustainability? I mean, we're going to come on and introduce Michael in a moment, but what are the kind of empathetic points or the sort of considerations that go into the way that you now work with, with the comms and brand guys within the organizations you work with?
I mean, I still would say that, my role is still very sustainability focused, still very communications focused, in that, I'm still delivering communications outcomes, but I'm doing it with the expertise that with a different lens, because we're trying to understand what is the regulatory environment, what do stakeholders understand, what is it that we actually need to be talking about, and what does good look like without drinking the Kool-Aid and thinking that we've thrown a few solar panels on the roof and let's go sing a song about it. I think it's really interesting because it's really, really challenging. Understanding sustainability is incredibly complex. I think a lot of marketing and communications people come to it excited to sort of be to be able to talk about progress in one way or another without necessarily understanding the bigger picture. That's I think where a lot of greenwashing has come in, where there is that enthusiasm without sort of necessarily matching that educational level of understanding. And I think one of the first things we can do to be able to actually address that as an issue is just support the educational, like continued education of anyone in the marketing and communication space. So they are actually being able to communicate about this in a way that they actually get it, because that's what the sustainability team will often say. They just don't get it. They try and simplify it too much, but they just don't understand it. You can't do this without the other. And so, having that expertise at the table from the outset I think will help anyone in this space. I also think, it just can't be siloed. And this is where it comes back to, that point about strategy. If you've got people that are siloed, if you've got things that are on the side, if you've got things that can be cut, if you've got something that's sidelined to the actual plan for business growth, it's never going to be sustainable. It's never going to be real, and you're never going to be able to have that authentic conversation, because it's not going to be authentic.
Julia, I love it. You're one of the best guests we've had. You are literally priming us for the next for our introduction of the article today. So that was brilliant. Thank you for that crescendo there. Julia, we could do a whole series on you and your background and going into all of your different perspectives on things, which perhaps could be a mini series. Who knows? We'll break it off. But I want to switch focus. Thank you so much for introducing us to you and your background and experience. Michael, can we switch to you now? And perhaps actually it would be really interesting. I do want to go back and look at the beginnings of your career, and again looking at those kind of key motivation and inspiration points, if you like. But perhaps just to provide our listeners with a bit of context, how do you and Julia work together? Like, what's the setup? What's the current company that you guys are involved in? I think that'd be a nice place just to start.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, unfortunately, I can't say that I was behind World Toilet Day, but I've done a few other things that have been worth talking about. So I am head of corporate strategy for Clarity. It's a global marketing and kind of digital marketing and comms agency. We've got offices in various places around the world, 6 offices across kind of UK, Europe, Asia, and the States. Julia and the company that she worked for, Sefiani, became part of Clarity not too long ago. So that's kind of how we work together. I think that one of the things that is really interesting with Clarity is that it's we've had various different areas of expertise, across sustainability, public affairs, digital, corporate comms, which is obviously where I sit in, and that makes it very, very exciting to work for. Mm-hmm. And I'll get into a bit of that later on. So I think that that's kind of why why Clarity is interesting. A lot of the people who came from Clarity, went to Clarity, came from big agencies, and wanted to have something that was kind of fast moving, but not that type of the small kind of startup corner shop either. So that kind of blend between big and small was really interesting. So I think it's a very interesting different agency in many ways, and my work with Julia has been really, really interesting since we kind of Clarity and Sefiani joined forces, so to speak, because in the world of comms, which we'll get on to a bit later on, in the world of comms has changed dramatically. It's changed dramatically, and it's very difficult to do, I would say almost impossible to do corporate comms without having, doing that through the lens of sustainability, public affairs, policy, regulations, because everything in that environment affects a corporate comms strategy. So, the work that Julia and I have done together has been, really interesting because, like I said, it gives a dimension to a comms and sustainability strategy that is very different than, if you would just do corporate comms siloed in its own way.
Michael, brilliant. You guys are an absolute dream. This is perfect. It's all been packaged together beautifully. But you're not going to get away with not taking us back to the beginning, especially in light of the fact that I noticed, having looked through your LinkedIn profile, that you are a Cardiff University alumni, if I'm not to be mistaken, which as am I. So I don't know where you want to kick things off. We can talk about, Taliban and Roath and all the local hotspots in Cardiff if you want to. But perhaps as Julia sort of led, it'd be great to get a background on you. And as I say, the kind of key inspiration points that have led you to the role that you're in now with Clarity.
Yeah, absolutely. So, we'll get to Cardiff. But I think that the story
the After Dark show, is it? That's the mini series at another time.
Oh, you did mention Taliban. I think that's also part for a different podcast. Maybe a walled one. I don't know, but so I've always been, genuinely interested in comms, in communications, in its purest form of just someone talking to someone about something interesting that is relevant to that other person. That's I've always been, in whatever form, whether that has been through news or through two people talking to each other or at an event or whatever. I've always been really interested in that, concept. Added to that, I've always been a news junkie. I was one of those who, waited for the last train to go home just so you can get tomorrow's papers at the newsstand at midnight, when they start selling them. So I've always, so the combination of those two, comms and really, deep interested in news and current affairs and everything, led me to have a degree in journalism. So I am from Sweden. I started studying languages at the university in Lund in Sweden, and after a couple of years, I moved to the UK because it was part of the Erasmus program that the EU had at the time. When the UK was part of the EU, and so I did my first year at Falmouth College of Arts down in Cornwall, and then moved to Cardiff. So I did my last 2 years at Cardiff University, an exceptionally good university for journalism. I was working with some really, really interesting people. I had the teachers who had been editors at the big papers, or really, really fascinating. So I did that, and then I had a few kind of internships as a journalist in London. GQ magazine, Maxim magazine were a couple, and then I also worked as a press officer, as a kind of a trainee press officer at organizations like Amnesty International in London and the Council of the European Union in Brussels. So, I kind of quite quickly got both sides of the fence, the people actually, writing the news and then the people communicating the news. So it was quite an interesting, I got both sides of the fence very early on. And then, it was around the dot-com boom. So, the whole tech industry was like, wow. And so I got my first job was in a very small agency in Soho, which was, one of those many agencies that were born out of the dot-com boom. Worked there for a couple of years and then moved on to some of the bigger agencies. And then, eventually came to Clarity. I think that one of the things that I have found very, very fascinating throughout my career in comms, and I've done a range of different things within comms, anything from media and influencer relations to crisis comms to messaging and brand development, thought leadership creation, a lot of coaching, media training, presentation coaching. Different things like that. I had the opportunity to work in many parts of the world. So I've worked in Asia. I worked in the US. I worked in most parts of Europe. I even had a job in the Caribbean. Providing some in Trinidad and Tobago, which was amazing. There's a large kind of accountancy body that had members over there that I, did the training for. So,
Michael, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but the things you'll do to have a complete kind of holistic experience in the world of commerce. You started by talking about having that genuine, fascinating interest in just communications. And it sounds like you've gone and essentially had experiences covering all aspects of communications, from journalism all the way through to the roles that you just described. And then crucially, you've gone and had a taste of it in all jurisdictions around the world, including, of course, the Caribbean. I mean, it's just amazing.
It is amazing. And what is fascinating when you kind of gain that insight into so many different cultures is, yes, there are big differences in terms of how the media works. In some countries, media is state-owned, which is very different world to now where everyone is a journalist through social media. So it's although that kind of the channel, so to speak, has changed dramatically, the principles of good communications are the same where and have always been the same wherever you go. Mm-hmm. In terms of just communicating something that is interesting and relevant to the people you're trying to talk to. That's of course is a lot harder said than done. But that's kind of and that's always been my philosophy is like really try to be interesting and relevant and let people know who you are and who your organization is and why that organization matters to them. So the principles are fairly simple. And so that's the thing that I've kind of, my conclusion after having done this for 30 odd years is that there are great variations around the world and with everything that is changing, those principles are still the same. Mm-hmm. We're living in a very, very different environment today. It's, the polarization of politics, the geopolitical challenges everywhere, the scrutiny on everything. I mean, we talk about sustainability. It's a huge, it's a huge area of importance, but also pressure point for a lot of organizations. And it is difficult to get right. It is difficult to get right because, I mean, you're dealing with small organizations who are very nimble and can do whatever they want. And then you got large organizations who have, legacy structures and century-old processes that, it's like moving a tank in some of those instances. So it is a very interesting time to work with, that's for sure.
But the point is that I'm taking from you, which I think is a fantastic sort of piece of advice, if you like, for anybody that is out there working broadly in the realms of sort of corporate communications, is to stick to those simple principles that you've alluded to. That actually, well, a lot of us are sort of, I think in the comm space, sort of, there's so many different influences, there's so much polarization, as you said, going on. There's so many different things to factor in, but actually bringing it back to some very simple core principles that were used in order to govern the way that we communicate. That's the thing to not lose sight of. Is that the flavor of what you're suggesting?
Absolutely. And comms is, for those who know comms, they know it's complex. But for a lot of people who don't maybe know the ins and outs of comms, it is complicated because you've got so many different stakeholders to take into account. You have customers, you have partners, you have employees, you have investors, you have regulators. And communicating something that's going to resonate with everyone is not always easy. Mm-hmm. But I do think that simplicity is key. It's a classic saying: if you have to explain your message, then it's not right. It's got to be easy to understand and relevant to people. It's also interesting how the environment around you changes the way comms is evolving. You're looking at two of the big events that we've had in recent time. You look at Brexit and you look at the pandemic. Those kind of moments change the way companies communicate. All of a sudden at Brexit, people were put in a very difficult spot because they were asked questions that they would never ask before, and everyone said, "Oh, I can't be political." And you realize, but there is no such thing as not being political. You're living in a world that is politicized, whether you want it or not. So if you want to have an opinion and a stance, you've got to be, so to speak, political. And then you had the pandemic, which forced people to be very, very open and communicative with what they did in safeguarding their staff and et cetera, et cetera. So I think that you've had events during the past few years that have really kind of had that, a real paradigm shift in how organizations are communicating. And it's very easy now to separate those who do it really well from those who just, are shying away from it and sticking their heads in the sand and thinking everything will be all right. And, and most often that doesn't work. So it's a fascinating industry to be in. That's for sure.
Michael, brilliant. I've done the classic thing with you guys. I knew this was going to happen, where we've just gone blitzed through our time. But it's fine. I'm fascinated by this, and I think our listeners will be too. Michael, I've got to ask you, in light of your experience, can you just touch on, Julia, I think, brilliantly provided us with that kind of timeline of evolution and development throughout her career, from CSR all the way through to the invention, if you like, of the concept of sustainability and the agenda obviously developing. From your perspective and looking at your career, can you just touch on kind of when these things started influencing your thinking, some of the points that you can remember in terms of major shifts in, you've alluded to the pandemic and Brexit in terms of, more recently, but just reflecting on your career, can you just plot us through how the development of the notion of a good corporate citizen, how that's affected the way that you've gone about developing what you do?
Yeah, and I think that it's a very good question. And I think that it's, comms is one of these things that I said, for me anyway, it's a job that is, extremely interesting because it never stands still, because there are always changes to it. And I do think that, the explosion of social media was a moment when you realized, okay, this is changing everything, because, no longer, you're under scrutiny. You're under scrutiny. Everyone can say what they want. That kind of really, I think, was really, because it did force every organization to think radically about what they did. And the whole kind of concept of honesty and transparency was tested, because you couldn't get away with anything anymore. So I thought that was a big moment. I think, unfortunately, now in an age of misinformation, etc., that's kind of taken it to the extreme. And that's another major, event that is, it's the whole debate about truth and trust. And you've as a company, it's very easy to lose control and in some ways having to surrender to, people who believe things that maybe aren't true, etc. So I think that is another kind of moment. It's made comms a lot more challenging, but also made it more interesting in many ways. And I think that also, there are, like I said, there are organizations who are doing this very well around the world, who are setting the bar very high. I do think that, came back to the pandemic, I thought that was very, very interesting, because, you look at it from a government communications perspective, you saw radically different ways of how that was approached. I mean, like I said, I'm Swedish. Sweden had a very, very different approach to the pandemic. Very, very kind of liberal approach to lockdowns, etc. Some countries were the opposite. The UK, no need to go into details there, but that wasn't always, it was very different. So that, I think, also, from a government, from a trust in government perspective, it was also a very, very different. It was a moment in time, because it was one of those moments where we didn't really have any. No one. This was unprecedented for people. This, there was no kind of past perfect way of doing things. So everyone looked to those in charge and said, well, what do we do now? How do we do this? So there was also a really, really important, I think, moment in time when you came to kind of trusting communications. And like I said, a lot of organizations did it really well, because they took a real kind of important stance and talking about what they did for their employees and etc. So, I think that those are some of the big events that have changed the way, it influenced my view on comms and how it should be done.
Super, Michael, fantastically interesting. There's that whole notion of, to me, the timeline of events, you've got almost the fueling of the fire, if you like, of social media and misinformation that was sort of ignited or further ignited by the stress test of the pandemic, if you like, and how suddenly, as you say, we were looking to these organizations that were in unprecedented times. There was no status quo, and they were being stress tested on how they go about communicating. And in all honesty, I know you gently alluded to it there, but I think we can safely say that there were some governments that I think failed fairly miserably on that front in terms of the way they communicated. But let's switch focus to the more positive side of things. Guys, that has been a brilliant introduction to both of you two. I should say, if anyone wants to check out Michael or Julia's LinkedIn, then we'll certainly be sharing it during our write-up. So would very much suggest to go and check out the careers, because they both massively underplayed themselves. So you can go and see the truth, if you like, on that. We're going to move forward now and sort of begin to look into kind of the main sort of body, if you like, of what we wanted to talk about today. We didn't talk about this before the recording. Who would like to introduce Seth and Monica's article in EY? Does one of you want to take the lead on the introduction to it?
Probably Julia is better with that.
Yeah, I mean, the introduction in terms of my initial thoughts of the article or what it's about.
Could you give our listeners just a flavor of what it's about, and then pick out, having given us a flavor, like what were the things that most sort of tweaked in your mind, and what were the things that were most sort of interesting?
Well, so I mean, it is all about what companies, but more specifically CEOs, need to be thinking about in the space of ESG. What really stood out for me from the outset was that it's an article that was written in 2 years ago in 2022. And it is an article very much of its time, reflecting the thinking of the time, which I think was quite intentional, Charlie. So if like looking through the article, there were a number of things that stood out, and that well, actually, firstly, let me just take a step back and say, you know, we all know that around 2021, around COP26, you know, companies, countries, everybody stood up and said, you know what, this is something I need to be part of. And, you know, I'm going to make a commitment, for example, towards, you know, net zero 2050. A lot of companies didn't necessarily have that roadmap in place at the time. They were more sort of encouraged to step forward and be part of that movement. And then we had 2022, where things started to catch up. We saw a lot of greenwashing take place. We saw a lot of that enthusiasm there, but then the regulators started to step up, and we started to see a lot of companies get called out for overstating their claims. And so the time in which this article was written is early in 2022, so before the regulators got their act together, and when there was, I guess, a bit more of a simplistic perception, and it was more about let's all just get behind this, and you know, this obviously makes a lot of business sense. So I would say the article has some really, you know, still has some really good points in it, but it's very sort of superficial. It doesn't take into consideration the well, it's not reflective of today's environment, which Gonz has already alluded to, in terms of the geopolitical landscape, in terms of you know, the impacts that has on supply chain, in terms of inflation, in terms of all of the headwinds that companies face today. So I think, you know, we talk about, you know, you need to make sure that your sustainability strategy is really robust, et cetera. Whereas, you know, sustainability is really tough, and it's ever evolving. And, you know, there is that constant need to you know, measure, reflect, evolve, because it's not a linear path. So I think the complexities of today and the way that we would talk about it today would just be different to the way it was introduced in this article.
Julia, that was brilliant. Thank you very much for that really kind of clear introduction. Let me ask you that I think the article, you might tell me if I've got this wrong, but it essentially alludes to the fact that CEOs need to look at implementing a kind of a 3-stage process, essentially, to integrate ESG within their organizations. First stage is to identify potentially all of the opportunities that there are in terms of ESG initiatives that could possibly be integrated. Second stage involves identifying those that they should prioritize and make most sense in terms of their current organizational setup, structure, etc. And then the third is to ultimately provide the right measuring and metric-based approach in order to ensure that they are on the right track. Out of interest, because I obviously totally agree with you that things have evolved significantly since in the last couple of years, but when you allude to the complexities or additional thinking that needs to go into implementing this stuff appropriately, give us a flavor of what are the additional elements that would go into that 3-stage process.
Well, so I mean, if we just break down this 3-stage process, find out what ESG elements matter most to your stakeholders, and I think that's not something that any sustainability professional would take as a first step. I mean, it's not about what necessarily matters to your stakeholders. It's what you should be doing as a company, and just because. I think, it even lists things like, is it reducing your carbon footprint, or is it designing products with less waste, or is it having greater impact in the community in which you operate, or having an inclusive workplace? And it's not is it this or is it that? It's in all of the above, and, how far are you going, and how are you actually doing this? So I think, when it comes to finding out what ESG matters to your stakeholders, I mean, that might be a lens that you take from a communications perspective, because of course, when you're communicating about sustainability, you say everything and you hear nothing. So understanding what wants to be prioritized in terms of communications to your stakeholders is important. But when it comes to actually what matters to your stakeholders in terms of ESG and implementing that, I mean, it's certainly not the first step that any company would take today. And it talks about, don't try and run every popular ESG initiative. I'm yet to find a popular ESG initiative. I don't think you do it because it's popular. You do it because it matters. So again, it's just that different language that you use. Like, I think, we also talk about, that sort of competitive advantage here, and that really opens the door to greenwashing. We were saying, we want to have that competitive advantage because we are doing the right thing. The competitive advantage comes from doing the right thing because you're setting yourself up in the marketplace for the longer term, but it is not, you're not doing it just for marketing. And I think, you still see marketing budgets well exceed sustainability budgets today, which is something that's really, really shocking. But, it's this kind of communication that really sees the way for that. So I'd say that, I think thinking has evolved a lot more in respects to that. And the third point is interesting, develop the blueprint for driving the right behavior. It sort of talks about, getting the right kind of metrics in place. But I mean, you can't have a solid sustainability strategy without multiple levels of metrics. And again, to be able to stop, reflect, evolve at every step of the way. So again, I just think the way that they've reviewed it is quite simplistic, and it's about sort of driving the right behavior. I say sustainability is or behavior change is so important in this space. I wouldn't necessarily just limit it to KPIs. That's another sort of broader conversation there. But those were my initial takeouts of the article. I think I've got a few more written down here as well.
Julia, let me just, I want to pick you up on that, because I think it's really interesting, kind of the time capsule of that article. And I think I want to pick up on that. I think the article begins by alluding to the fact that, CEOs need to stop viewing, and it was the classic thing from a couple of years ago, we need to stop viewing ESG as a tick box exercise and start seeing it for the sort of long-term value that integrating ESG across all aspects of our business can have. Fast forward a couple of years, and you mentioned regulation, you mentioned like the tightening of regulation over the last couple of years. The thing that I'm hearing so much in terms of speaking to sustainability, professionals essentially, is this kind of absolute fatigue that's occurring when it comes to this absolute mammoth influx of new regulatory requirements that involves now that sustainability is no longer about real true innovation and development. It's about compliance, it's about reporting, it's about measurement, etc. When you read that article and you see how it kind of alludes to, well, it's not just a tick box exercise anymore, but it's something that can provide you with value. Like, how does the last couple of years of the development and growth of sustainability from a compliance and reporting perspective, how do you then look back on that article? Is there anything that you think it again is sort of, well, it's obviously missing because it doesn't understand what's going to happen in the future. But what's your take upon that issue within the world of sustainability in terms of innovation versus compliance?
Yeah, I mean, it's a really important point. Like, I mean, particularly when you don't have, particularly about the point I made about the budgets. Budgets aren't necessarily big enough for sustainability if you actually look at how companies are investing their money anyway. But it's the amount of resource and focus that then goes into compliance is being taken away from actually doing the doing is obviously a very, very real problem that's felt everywhere. but at the end of the day, you still do need to have the measurement. You still do need to have, I mean, not that everything's standardized yet, but like you still need to be able to do your best to compare apples and apples, and to be able to communicate to your stakeholders to actually say, well, we're doing something that's meaningful. So I do support the idea, and I do think it's an important development. But I do also really sympathize with the fact that, you know, the role is so intensive. You know, you have a lot of passionate people who've been sort of working to get the world to wake up about this for, you know, decades, and the world, you know, has finally woken up about it, but now their jobs are like, the job to do is so challenging. So you know, are we going too far the other way? Like I still think it's important. I wouldn't turn it off if given the option. But I do appreciate the stress and the pressure and the difficulty and the resources diverted from the doing as a result of it.
And what implication, that was brilliant, Julia. And out of interest, what implication, coming on and talking now a little bit about the impact of this on communications, like what is the impact? Like, are you guys seeing that? And again, I'm gonna make this seem very simplistic, so feel free to shoot me down if I'm oversimplifying. But from a comms point of view, you guys are looking for, you know, these presumably really inspiring stories to tell about the innovations that clients are making in the realms of sustainability. Like, what implication of perhaps a reduction in or a slowing down of innovation and much more focus on compliance and reporting within the space? Like, what implications has that had for communications?
I mean, yeah, I think it absolutely has a huge implication, because I mean, you don't really talk about sustainability as in, you know, we're a sustainable company beyond, you know, the actions that you take. It all comes down to what you're doing, how you're doing it, and how you're doing more, and going above and beyond, you know, what is actually expected of you as a company, because anything else and anything lower is just hygiene. And then that just pushes companies who aren't able to have that sort of, you know, more thought-provoking, that more exciting conversation where they are trying to drive something that's beyond the expected. It pushes them into that bucket where they're a little bit, you know, hands are tied, they are doing the hygiene. And so, you know, on and on they go. But it doesn't necessarily allow them to communicate beyond their own channels about the fact that they're actually, you know, investing still investing a lot of money, still doing a lot of work, still being compliant, still ticking some boxes. But, you know, they don't have those more interesting stories to tell. So look, it's not the case across the board. I think it is the case across the board that everyone feels the pressure, but, you know, it's certainly hitting a particular tier of company, and limiting their opportunities.
Now, out of interest, let's that was really interesting, Julia, and I think very much aligns with my own personal experience, which is good to hear that it all marries up, and it's the same over in Oz as it is over here. Let me ask you, the article alludes to the fact that, and I know we're talking more broadly here about embedding ESG within corporate strategy. It talks about the need to find, obviously, the popular ESG initiatives to really focus one's attention on, which I know you've already refuted as perhaps the way that we're now looking at ESG from a corporate strategy perspective. But from a comm strategy perspective, and maybe Michael, I can bring you in here as well. From a comms perspective, is that still a key part of how you go about developing a strategy with a prospective client, through the work perhaps that you do at Clarity, that you're looking to think about, well, what are the most impactful and most popular areas of ESG that we can look to build our comm strategy around? Or have I just got that completely wrong? Let me know.
No, I mean, I think, oh, sorry. Did you want to?
No, go ahead.
I was just going to say, I mean, I see all the time, you see a company that you know exactly what they should be doing in terms of having the biggest impact, and they communicate about something completely irrelevant, because, you know, they might have had more progress in that particular area, and it might not, you know, an average person might not necessarily be able to see the difference and see the fact that, you know, that is obviously a very superficial message compared to what they actually should be doing. Mm-hmm. We like to have authentic conversations with our clients. We like to be able to support them in that. And that means, you know, where are you having the greatest impact? Where are you actually able to move the needle the furthest? And that's where the conversation should start. But understanding what stakeholders care about is still really important, because of course you need to meet from a communications perspective your stakeholders where they are at in terms of their level of understanding, their education on the topic, and what it is that they genuinely care about. Otherwise, you will not be successful in your engagement, of course.
Mm-hmm.
So it is a very important part of it, but we like to start where you can create the biggest impact.
Julia, I'm going to ask you for an example. So you've alluded to at the beginning of that response, a situation in which an organization clearly should be perhaps focusing their comms on one particular area of ESG initiative, but actually starts talking about or communicating about a completely separate one. Can you give us an example?
I mean, so where you've got food companies talking about talking about renewable energy. I mean, like renewable energy is a really, really common one. It is in many areas like lower hanging fruit compared to what the bigger changes that companies should be making. I think there was a big wave of supermarkets that started celebrating all the great work they're doing, because a number of supermarkets have 100% renewable energy in certain sites, et cetera, et cetera. And it's like, well, that's great, and absolutely, but that is not what you should be focusing on first, right? So, it is about, I think educating. I'm quite passionate about the idea of educating consumers so they know what good looks like when they're actually looking at different, products or services, but also educating marketers so they can actually put the message out first and question, is this the right thing to be talking about? And stakeholders, so and like partners, they know what to be looking for. When in terms of what good looks like.
Julia, I love that. I'm going to do a slight plug here for the charter. We've actually started mandating all of our signatories to include a section within their green claims policies, which is titled stakeholder education. So looking at every organization that signs our charter has to detail essentially what initiatives they've got in place in order to further stakeholder understanding and appreciation of the issues at play. So great to hear that you've just glowingly endorsed the fact that we've got that in there. I had to get that little cheeky plug in there. Let me ask you about when you talk about let me talk about dilution. So from what you described there, I mean, my experience is that we all I don't know, there's always those messages or numbers in terms of the number of advertising or marketing messages or comms messages that we're receiving every day. It's obscenely high. We're all oversaturated with all of these things. Is the real issue at play, and maybe Michael, you can jump in here as well, is the real issue at play that we only have a finite amount of attention from any particular stakeholder at any particular point in time? And from an ESG perspective, although we might be doing all of the brilliant sort of sphere, and we should be doing all of the things relating to ESG initiatives, renewable energy as a food company, et cetera, but the key thing to do is to not dilute our message by trying to share too much, and instead go back to that fundamental principle you spoke about, Michael, at the beginning, which is communicate something clearly and communicate something engaging with your audience. Is that a key part of, from a comms perspective, getting ESG communications correct?
Yeah, and I think that, like this, I think, this article was written at a time when people were talking about using ESG as a competitive advantage, it's an opportunity to tell everyone what you do. And I think that from a comms perspective, you've moved beyond that. Now it's like there is an expectation that companies are doing the right thing, that at least they got the basics right, in that, where they don't take, jets to fly from one city to the next, and when they can do it over a Zoom call, or that they are, paying their people on time. And, so I think that, I think from a comms perspective, you've got to make sure that you got the basics covered.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not a proactive communication. That is just who you are. That is what is expected. So where I do think that there's an opportunity to communicate proactively is maybe where you've done something new, something courageous, something that has proven to be very impactful from an ESG perspective, but communicating it in a way that isn't just self-serving, that is actually, hey, others can do this. So it's almost like a bit of a call to action when you say, look, this is what everyone should be doing because it worked for us. That I think is where a comm strategy is, because I think, it's particularly if you look at journalists, like the media is extremely skeptical, right? So the moment that you go out and you say, hey, look, we pay everyone on time. Hey, look, we don't have a pay gap. It's like, okay, it's I think that and look, the other thing is, I think that is interesting. I mean, obviously, I think Julia and I have talked about this quite often. The S in ESG is often the thing that gets the most attention. Sorry, the E and the environment part. But the social and the governance sides, you still see in a lot of issues. I mean, you still look at pay gaps. You still see harassment at work. Look, I'm not going to mention it on a podcast, but look at what happened at the CBI. There's a lot of organizations that still today are failing big time and that has created a sentiment and an atmosphere in the media that is like, people are picking on this. So if you go out and you proactively communicate something that everyone is just expected to be normal, good business, you're going to shoot yourself in the foot. But I do think, and that's where I think a lot of the startups are really good, is that they come out and they come up with new initiatives or products that are really kind of, creating transparency in sustainability, or where you can track payments in the supply chain to make sure you don't have late payers. Those are the things that should be communicated proactively, because it forces others to follow that trend.
Michael, I love that. I again, you did a brilliant. I'm going to butcher this in terms of regurgitating what you just said, but one of the things that I took from that was how disarming it is if we as an organization look to communicate an initiative from the perspective of we've done something that we think is impactful and we think it's cool, but we're not just sharing it from a point of view of look how great we are, the boastful child sat in the classroom with the coolest thing that they brought in for show and tell, but actually, hey, everybody else I'm going to continue this analogy. It might be a terrible thing, but hey, everybody else in the class, you can play with my toy too. I.e., it is here to be shared. It is an open source of this is a gift to the rest of our competitors, our stakeholders, etc., to look to engage with this as well. The disarming nature of that is really compelling. Is that have I understood that correctly?
Absolutely. Because often it needs someone to break the status quo.
Mm-hmm.
It needs someone to stick their neck out and say, hey, look, we got it wrong. We tried this worked. There are many others in the same boat, follow that. Mm-hmm. Or that someone has invented something new that is just, great. But this is also where governments have a big part to play. Governments need to set the standard for, things to be done right. Whether diversity is another big issue, of course, in terms of, there's still a huge lack of diversity in workplaces, and so I do think that it's the classic thing. I mean, in a way, governments shouldn't have to go in and force businesses to do it right, but we all know that if you can avoid it, you quite often do, because it's costly. It's so I do think it's that kind of balance between self-governance and regulatory governance, in terms of there's a huge kind of companies themselves need to lead by example, and as you say, let others play with their toys if they've got good toys. Go on, Julia. Sorry.
I was going to say, I mean, it's what it's leadership. Like, every company is trying to address so many different challenges, all of which really cost a lot of money, a lot of time, a lot of resource. In the case of any big company, we're steering some very, very big ships here. The more that companies collaborate, and we're seeing a lot more great examples of this, the more companies collaborate, the more we're able to actually, see progress on different issues, the more they're able to invest their time and effort into actually, moving that forward. And we need to see more examples of that. We need to be congratulating organizations when we see those examples more. It's a critical part of actually, achieving any progress.
Julia, that's a super interesting point. And we've actually had a show previously with an organization called Pineapple Partnerships, who we specifically looked at the role of partnerships and collaborations. And you've just brought me back to that as well. It's really interesting. I think that, as you both alluded to, it's from a self-governance perspective, and then bring in comms. It's the value that you as an organization can ultimately see and being able to communicate these things in the way that we've just described and ultimately see the tangible value benefit essentially of being able to do so. So I think this is really compelling. I could carry on. I've got loads of other. I feel like we are definitely, if you've enjoyed it, we're going to have to get you back on for show number 2, but I'm slightly wary of running time. Guys, you know that we finish every show with a magic wand question. So I'm happy for either of you to jump in to first answer this. But as always, the question is, if I could hand you the magic wand and you could change one thing about the commercial world right now, what would that one thing be? Julia, maybe.
Well, I'd say shift share prices to deliver on the future health of the planet. And that could be assessed via the SDGs, for example. And so you're really looking at, how well companies are genuinely delivering on all 17 goals, and you'll start to actually be rewarding the right people.
What an incredibly practical and very, very clear and simple suggestion that would fundamentally change the system. Brilliant. Follow that, Michael. That's a tricky one to follow.
Well, I would say stop obsessing about the short term and what's around the corner and start seeing things in the long term and actually understanding that what you do has a long-term impact, both negatively and positively.
Beautiful. I mean, succinct and clear and practical and brilliant. Guys, thank you so much for joining us today. I, for one, have had a great time. I hope you have too. Really enjoyed the show, and hopefully we might encourage you to come back on at another time.
Love to anytime.
Yeah, thanks so much, Charlie. It's been really fun.
Thanks so much for the opportunity.